What's up, guys? This is Carroters, and welcome back to the Carrot Poker Podcast. Today I'm doing a segment without guests, all alone in my poker study. Unfortunately, woe is me. But I'm going to do a strategy segment for you guys for a change. And yeah, we're going to talk about 5 things that 100NL regs do that 10NL regs don't do. I really need a catchier title than that, but basically 5 mistakes that I have a lot of people that I coach playing at 10NL, and the most common things that are lacking in their game, and similarly of their opponents' games, that are creating the kind of ceiling effect that 10NL Zoom these days on stars, is that they're just doing a bunch of things wrong. And I've pinpointed 5 and of these things, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, that I think are the most important. 5 of the most important things. There are many more where these came from that 10NL regs are not doing, but the players in the games that I play are certainly doing. And herein lies the difference of why those players who are playing 50 and 100 and 200 are sort of climbing the poker ladder. Well, 10NL is kind of like the new 100NL. It's kind of where the ceiling is at. I remember back when I was coming up the ranks, there was this big jump. The first really taxing jump for me in my poker career, I guess, was playing 100 and getting to 200. And then actually winning at 200, which I found much harder than winning at 100NL back in the day. These days, it's so sick to say that this kind of ceiling effect kicks in just way, way lower. Knowledge is just far more commonplace these days. People know a hell of a lot about poker, and I actually think that the ceiling is now at around 10NL, 25NL, 16NL, somewhere around there on stars. Of course, on the softer sites, US sites are different. Bovada's pretty soft. Sky Poker here and all kinds of UK sites are quite soft as well. But if you want to play in the heart of poker and stars and play Zoom, 10NL is tough these days. So, without further ado, let's get into what the 5 things are that the regs at 10NL are just not doing that they should be doing to make progress through to 25, 50, and 100NL. First of all, number 1, 10NL regs don't appreciate long-term EV and what their own range looks like before the flop. So, I'll give you an example to illustrate what I mean by this. I'll have a student say something like, okay, I 3-bet King Jack offsuit here because, or let's take an even worse hand, King 8 offsuit here against the cutoff opener when I was in the big blind because he folds to a lot of 3-bets. And I'll say, right, okay, cool. That's good that you're adjusting to that and you're exploiting it by 3-betting a bit of a lighter polarized range as a bluff. Using good hands for value, calling some hands in between, then using weaker hands as a bluff. That's the right approach against someone who folds a lot. When you're in the big blind closing the action, you want to be polar there. But there's a problem with using hands like King 8 off. It just means that you're using an enormous amount of combinations as part of your 3-bet bluff range. And you'll see regs like this at 10NL all the time. Their 3-bet stat in the big blind against a button open will be 18%, 25%, because they are literally just sometimes using hands they just feel like 3-betting because they look to your 3-bet number, fold the 3-bet number, and it's high over their small sample. And so what they're doing is they're adopting an extremely unbalanced strategy for no good reason that hurts a lot more than it gains. Because when you start 3-betting King 8 off, it follows from that you're 3-betting a hell of a lot of other hands, big blind versus cutoff, that are more suitable, maybe suited aces that you're not flatting, or suited connectors, suited gappers, double blocker hands like King Jack off and stuff like that, King 10 off. You'll be 3-betting all of that as well. And what it's doing is it's skewing your overall range to the point that you're 3-betting an enormous amount of combos as a bluff. And if you're only 3-betting Jacks plus and Ace Queen suited plus for value, that's only 44 combos. And so you're going to quickly be dwarfing those 44 value combos by using all those bluffs. And it gives your opponent a very easy time just saying, oh look, this guy 3-bets 20%. I'm just going to tighten my open range, open smaller, flat way more in position, play back more post-flop, 4-bet more pre-flop. Just do all the kinds of things that make your life miserable. But you're asking for it because you've opened up this massive hole in their game. They'll also do this, the regs at 10NL, by just 4-betting you just because they feel like it. You 3-bet them, they have a king in their hand, that's good enough for them. Or maybe they even 4-bet you with 8-6 off. Who knows what these guys use? You don't really see because oftentimes you ship over it, you don't see showdown. But what you do know is that every time you 3-bet them, they 4-bet you because they don't really understand that, okay, well, you might be 3-betting somewhat lighter, or maybe you're probably not even 3-betting that light against them. You're probably quite balanced, actually. It's just that some of your range is bluffs if you're polar, or weaker linear hands if you're linear. But in any case, they assume that you're 3-betting super wide, and they see that your 3-bet number is 9%, which is not that wide anyway. That can be a decent ratio of bluffs to value. And then they start 4-betting you just with any 2 cards, and they don't realize that the difference between vacuum EV and long-term EV, and that difference is that just because a hand is profitable in a vacuum, even if it is profitable to 4-bet like ace-4 offsuit in a vacuum, over the long run they're creating that same situation as the light 3-better was, where his range is super skewed towards bluffs and therefore very easy to exploit. And I have an easy time, even at the games I play, like shoving over people who have this leak up there, and at 10NL it's even more prevalent. So 3-bet shoving over these players is definitely a really good way to exploit the fact that they're just not aware of their range. They're like, okay, I play back in this one hand in a vacuum. They don't see the bigger picture. They don't see the inference that the good player makes there, which is, hold on a minute, if you're 4-betting me with king 4 off, you're probably 4-betting me with like your entire range in that one instance. Therefore, you're very capable of just having an extremely wide 4-bet bluff range that is very bad for you. And if you're folding to 5-bets like 85% of the time, then just ship me the money, just send it all my way right away. And a good player will exploit you for that. So that's number one. Not appreciating the difference between vacuum EV and long-term EV pre-flop, and understanding the shape of your range and knowing that just because something's plus EV in a vacuum, perhaps it's not going to be plus EV as part of a coherent long-term strategy when you bloat your range so dramatically. There only are so many combos in the deck that you can be dealt, 1,326 to be precise. If you only have 44 of those in your value range and you're opening 900 of them from the button, then that's quite a lot of bluffs if you 4-bet everything else in your range, just saying. Right, on to the next one. 10NL regs don't bluff enough on the later streets. God, you can have such an easy time, seriously, just calling flop, calling turn, folding river against these guys. Some of them like bet turn because they don't really understand that, like, just because a king came on the turn, it doesn't mean they should bet their entire range. Again, balance just goes out the window at 10NL. No one cares about it. No one knows about it. They haven't understood how to think out with a vacuum yet. This is going to be the central theme behind this whole podcast. But it manifests itself in lots of different ways. And one of them is that, well, they'll bluff like, there's usually a huge disparity between their turn barreling ranges and their river barreling ranges on some textures, and indeed their flop barreling ranges and their turn barreling ranges as well. But I'm more talking about barreling the river. It's just something they don't really do. They tend to just give up the river a hell of a lot, having bet the first two streets as a bluff. And your win to showdown in those games in 10NL Zoom can actually be quite low. And against the population, when you see a reg, you should be playing against the reg pop, as I call it, the reg population. You should already just be assuming that player is a bit skewed to value on the river at least, and you should be looking to slightly undercall and overfold your range on the river. Calling, not saying like go into full explo mode and just fold every single bluff catcher, but certainly fold most of the bluff catchers that don't have good blockers to their value range, that aren't suitable ones to call down, and you'll just do pretty well there. It's a weird thing. I mean, it is hard to balance bluffing ranges on later streets. It's difficult. It takes some practice to do that. I recommend like going into Poker Ranger. The program is awesome. Just playing around with looking at your range pre-flop, breaking it down on the flop into parts, breaking it down on the turn again, seeing how many combos you're value betting, how many you're bluffing, looking for roughly even ratios on the turn. But when you get to the river, if you're betting 2/3 pot, then the idea, going into like GTO mode for a minute here, game theory optimal mode, if you bet 2/3 pot on the river, then your opponent's going to need about 28-29% equity to break even on a call. So you want to make sure he has that much equity if you're going to be balanced there right off the bat, if you don't want to over or under bluff. So you want to make sure that you're bluffing 28 or 29% of the time and value betting the rest of the time, making him indifferent to calling his bluff catchers. So to do that, you're looking at roughly a 3-to-1 ratio, not even that much, like 2.5-to-1 ratio of bluffs, of value to bluffs. So you're just looking to fill those bluffs in with the most suitable hands. And you can work on range building and stuff, even if you're not doing it exactly, as long as you're bluffing like the most suitable combos. Like, just make sure that you have some bluffing range against regs that fold, unless the population's stationary or something, which I don't think it's that stationary these days in 2015. Have bluffing ranges on the later streets. Like, you need them to be balanced. And also, if everyone's playing against their population and like folding the river lots, I bet there's a bunch of fold equity there as well, just given that people tend to shut down so much on the river. It's like they're okay c-betting, they're okay barreling the turn, that's like allowed, but as soon as they get to the river, it's like, whoa, they just shut down all their air. It's such a common tendency, so make sure you're not doing that. But also, by the same token, don't go so far in the other direction here, just over bluffing the river, because that's going to become obvious as well. Like, balance is more important than people used to think, put it that way. But have a bluffing range on the river, like in spots where it's good, because it's extra EV. Number 3, people at 10NL fail to find good exploitative folds. Now, by exploitative folds, I don't mean like calling down. I don't mean like they're calling down against a reg who looks aggro. I mean players who are generally not bluffing very much, like that triple tendency. I don't think people like fold the river even as much as they should, because Regs don't bluff the river very much, but people still probably call the river too much with like marginal bluff catchers and things like that. People also like just don't fold to lines that are just seriously strong. Like when a fish calls your turn bet, calls your flop bet, and then like min raises you the turn, so you bet 6 on the flop, you bet 15 on the turn, they raise you to 32, and like the flushes just come in. Like the fish just has like the nuts so often there. Even when the flush hasn't come in, if that's a passive fish, he just has like a set or 2 pair or whatever. So much. So letting go of marginal hands exploitatively, and by that I mean folding a larger chunk of your range than you would if you were balanced, against lines where people aren't bluffing, like nits firing 3 at you, they just have the nuts all the time. Like that 17-15 reg who is like suddenly raised your turn bet, he just has a set. You know, these kind of things, these spots where people are really unbalanced, they're not finding enough folds, I guess, to really take advantage of that like they should be. Just to give you guys some example lines of what I'm talking about here. The death line is one, where fish calls flop raises turn. That's definitely one. Also, like in 3-bet pots, people triple off like even less than they do in 2-bet pots. They're just afraid to like shove a whole stack in there with nothing, even though a balanced strategy would have you do that. And it would be like optimal in theory to do that if you're playing against someone else who's playing optimally at least some percentage of the time. But regs just tend not to bluff in 3-bet pots on later streets on the river especially. So what you need to be doing there is finding exploitative folds against the population, especially against the 18-16 guy. If you call his 3-bet with like queens and the flop comes like jack 5-4 and he bets 3 streets at you, don't call down with queens, because you're just going to lose an overwhelming majority of the time. And although queens is so close to the top of your range, that doesn't matter, because you need to be finding an exploitative fold there. And just letting the hand go. But oftentimes against fish, people just lose way too much money against passive fish, but it's so unavoidable, you know, when they wake up with a hand. And I guess the real skill is, I've got this worksheet called Facing Strong Lines, and it's like 10 questions where we face fish being aggressive, and in some of the lines, like, we should fold because they just have such a nutted line there, the fish population. In other lines, it's something they'll do with a wider range. For instance, while a fish will very rarely call your flop bet and min raise the turn without a very strong hand, they will sometimes do things like min raise the flop to your c-bet with just any old top pair or middle pair to find out where they're at or whatever. That's not a strong line. Or when a fish is like shoves over your river bet, that is super strong. But when a fish bets the river when the turn's checked through, that's much weaker. So that homework sheet's all about getting familiar with which lines you can make these exploitative folds against. And I think the players who make it up there just limit the damage to their blue line by apparent coolers. Like a 10NL player will say something to me like, this is a cooler. And I'll say, no, it's not, because the fish's line is just ridiculously face up and unbalanced there. So finding exploitative folds is definitely a good thing to do. Number 4, players at 100 NL Zoom avoid auto c-betting. If you look at the average c-bet stat of the 100 NL reg, it'll be somewhere where it's supposed to be, between 55 and 65%, something like that. Meaning that player understands the importance of like checking showdown value, protecting their checking range, that kind of thing, not c-betting multi-way in bad spots, not c-betting with terrible equity against opponents who float, not c-betting too wide out of position, understands these kind of leaks and how to avoid them. Whereas at 10NL, the regs are just completely stuck in like 2006, and they're just like, oh, I raised pre, I c-bet. It's just so first level, it's bad, it's not going to win in 2015. You need to start understanding how to play your range in these spots, and not just say, oh, look, the board is kind of dry, I'm going to c-bet. Like sometimes people only ever think about board texture. There are about 6 or 7 factors you need to think about when c-betting to reel a few off. You need to think about board texture, opponent stationiness, like opponent type. You need to think about how multi-way or heads up the pot is. You need to think about your equity when called. You need to think about future fold equity and future equity that you can turn, and how many turns and river runouts you like. You need to think about your implied odds if you hit your draw against the opponent. There's just so many little things that make up a good c-bet decision, and on top of all that, you need to actually branch out and think about your range and think, how is my range wanting to play this flop? Is my range weak or strong? What size does my range want to c-bet here? Can I get away with c-betting my whole range? Is my opponent going to be able to exploit me on this texture if I do that? Do I have range advantage here? Does my opponent have is he on an even keel with who has the nutted hands? This kind of thing. Loads of stuff, loads of information out there on grinderschool.com. I've done loads of videos on c-betting and things like that. So the info is there. It's on all kinds of trading sites. You can find good info on c-betting. There's no excuse for being one of these auto drones that just c-bets every single flop and has a c-bet stat of 78, 85, 90% I've even seen. They 3-bet, they c-bet every texture. They don't care how it relates to your range. They don't care how bad their equity is. and then they one and done. They give up so much. There's, like I say, huge disparity between their c-bet range on the flop and their c-bet range on the turn. So 10NL regs are just auto c-bet monkeys for the most part, and are just not basically thinking about the right things and formulating good strategies and branching out and thinking about their range. Again, coming back to that theme of long-term EV and thinking about how they play their range, they just don't do it very well, if at all. And evidence is there in the stuff they show down, and it gives you a direct route to exploiting them, and that's why I feel like if I was to go and play 10NL Zoom, I'd have an easy time just exploit. Whereas if I was playing 100NL, I'm much more in the frame of mind of balance first, defense first, and only if I see someone playing badly and unbalanced am I going to start attacking them in any kind of very unbalanced way myself. Otherwise, I'm just opening a hole to be exploited. So you need to be aware of these things for sure. Auto c-betting is a big one. Let's move on to number 5. Balancing checking ranges as PFR, as pre-flop raiser. People are so abysmal at this at 10NL. It's like heartbreaking to watch. Sometimes my students will like post a hand, I'll be like, they'll check fold the flop, and I'll be like, what do you check here? And they'll be like, oh, air. And I'll be like, so what do you do with middle pair? I bet. What do you do with like top pair weak kicker? I bet. What do you do with top set? I bet. And they're not balancing their checking range at all. And that means that when they check to their opponent out of position, their opponent can literally just bet their entire range and just print money, and they're never doing anything about it because they're not developing a check calling range or a check raising range. It's hard to balance check raising ranges with all the other ranges you're going to have because they're limited good combos. So I'm not saying you necessarily need a check raise range, although there are situations where I think it's good. But the point is that they're not check calling enough as pre-flop raiser, and they're putting themselves in this situation where A, they are turning showdown value into bluffs and bloating pots with it, and playing showdown value against their opponent's calling range instead of their opponent's betting range, which is not a good idea. And by showdown value, I mean like moderate to good strength hands, not like incredibly strong nutted value getting hands. And the other reason that's really bad is that when they check, they're just basically waving the white flag and they're folding 85-90% of their range. There's a stat in PT4 called float flop, and it doesn't mean float in the conventional sense. It means bet versus miss c-bet in position. And when you see someone with a float flop of like 75-80%, you should just be betting like even pocket fours on queen jack 6, like the worst hands for you to possibly ever bet that have abysmal equity when called. You should still be betting these hands just to take the pot down against someone who's folding that much. So it becomes correct for villain. Another thing they do, and this is something that I guess I didn't like incorporate into the list, but it's so linked to this point, is that they'll actually stab way too much as well, in theory, but that's because the population folds. There's just this tendency that when you check at 10NL Zoom as a pre-flop raiser, you're check folding, and that's somehow inherent and accepted as a norm, like a cultural norm, like the way it is. And therefore, say you're blind versus blind, you're big blind, small blind checks to you, there's almost this weird reg understanding that, oh, he's check folding, and I'm just going to win the pot from him. And the small blind's like okay with this because he just doesn't balance his range. And then the next time when it's the other way around and I'm in the small blind and he's in the big blind, I'll check fold to him because I'm a 10NL reg and I don't balance my range. And no, let's break it. Let's stop the pattern and learn how to check call as pre-flop raiser, learn how to check raise as pre-flop raiser, learn how to have a stronger checking range so that you're not just so easy to play against. So, I mean, they just play those spots so badly, those c-bet situations, particularly out of position. They play them horribly. They either check fold way too much or they c-bet way too much, and they don't balance things. You need a check call range as pre-flop raiser if you're going to be in any way balanced. Because if you c-bet everything, you have air all the time when you c-bet. If you check everything, if you c-bet all your good hands and just check fold all your air, then you're going to have a terribly weak range when you check. So you do need a check call range, whatever way you want to look at it. Anyway, I'll wrap up there for today, guys. Next time I'm sure I'll have another student back on the show for some more interviews and see how the learners are getting on, playing the lower stakes and things like that. And yeah, I'll do another one of these in the future where I have a list of stuff that 10NL regs do. I'm sure I can think of more population tendencies, but those are the main ones for now. Hope you enjoyed this segment, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye for now.
The way you sliver, girl, send shivers down my spine. One thought of you damn knocks me right out every time. But lately I've been slaking from